If you're unfamiliar with what a Genwunner is, like I was until not too long ago, it's basically a Pokemon fan that only likes the first generation of Pokemon, right? The games, the anime, and everything in between. They essentially denounced everything post-Kanto. It's become a fairly prevalent meme among the Pokemon player base. So I wanted to take a little stroll through the mindset of these Pokemon fans. There could be completely innocent reasons for someone being a Genwunner, such as nostalgia bias for example, but there are some more toxic Genwunners who will say some seemingly nonsensical things. So yeah, I want to try and weigh in as a somewhat older player myself. I want to address some common Genwunner arguments, take an empathetic approach, and maybe play a little devil's advocate along the way as well. So the first thing I want to touch on here is inanimate object Pokemon. Genwunners don't like them, apparently, particularly the newer ones. Some popular examples thrown around being Litwick, Vanillite, Klefki, Trubbish. Pokemon that aren't based on animals, essentially. Now the counter-argument to that mindset from most people is, well, what about Gen 1 Pokemon like Voltorb, Magnemite, Grimer? They're inanimate as well, so why are you only picking on the newer inanimate Pokemon? So I think the wrong argument is being made by the Genwunner side here. I think they're getting their point mixed up a bit. I don't think the problem is these newer Pokemon being inanimate, because as you can see, we've always had them. I think the problem is that these new Pokemon take the forms of man-made, everyday inanimate objects, and very specific ones as well. You know, things like ice creams and keyrings and bags of rubbish, they're not something that can seemingly occur naturally. And I'm not saying that the Pokemon universe is on point for realism, because it absolutely isn't. What I suppose I'm trying to say is that Gen 1 inanimate Pokemon are simple objects that had obvious backstories for how they came to be. You know, the likes of Voltorb and Magnemite were said to be born out of abnormalities caused by human industrial activities. The newer ones are a bit more esoteric, and I think the Genwunners here just need to spend a minute looking into the dex entries for these newer Pokemon, and it'll start to make more sense. You know, I get it. How does a Pokemon suddenly appear that just so happens to look like a bag of trash? Well, it was chemical reactions from heaps of industrial waste that gave birth to it, and then they reproduced from there. I know that when I properly looked into this, it made me like the Trubbish line a whole lot more. I personally like a lot of the newer inanimate Pokemon. Klinklang has become my favourite steel type. I absolutely adore the Litwick line. Ghost types are definitely easier to explain because, you know, ghosts can possess pretty much anything. But I'd be lying if I said that I didn't have a little bit of disdain for the idea of making Pokemon based on everyday man-made objects. So I constantly contradict myself with this one all the time. I suppose it's entirely a personal choice thing. But I think that if there's decent lore and backstory to inanimate Pokemon, they're actually pretty cool. For the rest of them, suspension of disbelief is gonna have to hold you through. The second argument I see a lot is, new Pokemon designs don't look like Pokemon, / the older designs are better. Now again, there's a simple counter argument to this that many people give, which is, look at some of the Gen 1 Pokemon like Rattata, it's just a rat. Ekans, it's just a snake. Seal, it's a seal. But again, I think the wrong argument is being made by the Genwunner crowd here. I don't think they're really articulating exactly what they mean. I think we have to understand what Pokemon was originally intended to be in the minds of many people. This obviously is most likely wrong, but I see how people got to this conclusion. And that is that Pokemon were meant to be animals. Well, technically monsters, but let's not get into semantics. In the Pokemon world, it's sort of implied that normal animals don't exist. They're all Pokemon. So there are no rats, only Rattata. There are no butterflies, only Butterfree. And so on and so on. I know this isn't strictly adhered to in the anime at a couple of points, and from what I know it's not canon whatsoever that Pokemon exist in place of normal animals. Like I said, it's just a universal headcanon for many Pokemon fans that that's the case. So I think what Genwunners are really trying to get at here is that the newer Pokemon don't share the same design philosophy as the older ones. So there's a subheading to be had there in that Pokemon designs have changed a lot over the years. They've become more intricate as a whole, obviously with some exceptions here and there. Older Pokemon couldn't have too many colours or features because they had to be simple enough to be able to be represented as small game sprites on the Game Boy. So most older Pokemon from generations 1 to 3, I'll say, are simple designs and have just 2 or, at a stretch, 3 colours to their palettes. Now we're in the 3D era, they don't have to do that anymore. Pokemon designs and colour palettes can be as complex as they want, and that means that the concepts for the Pokemon can be more out there these days. For someone that consumed the early days of Pokemon, I suppose there was an internal precedent set in my mind, and probably the minds of other older players too, for what Pokemon looked like. You know, the classic design style and the minimal colour palettes. For me, that's what made Pokemon distinct from Digimon or Yu-Gi-Oh! Now that the design philosophy's changed, I think that's why you've got people saying that Pokemon look like Digimon now. But again, it's all completely down to the person and possibly when they came into the franchise as well. There'll be many people now that prefer the newer designs over the older ones. A lot of my favourite Pokemon these days are the newer designs. The designs have changed over the years, that was inevitable. Just enjoy the ones you like, I guess is my best advice on this one. Up next, we've got Pokemon Red and Blue will always be the best Pokemon games. Now this is where I definitely think nostalgia bias comes in, because I too have incredibly fond memories of the Gen 1 games, and even more so the Gen 2 games. I owe so much of my childhood happiness to those games, it's kinda pathetic. For me, Pokemon Crystal will always be my favourite Pokemon game. It will always hold that title because of the experience and enjoyment I got out of it. But is Pokemon Crystal objectively better than the new games? Not a chance. For a start, the Gen 2 remakes, Soul Silver and Heart Gold, are levels above it. But that's speaking objectively from a game design point of view. So I think the same thing applies here. I think Genwunners are speaking from a point of emotion and nostalgia. Before I played them, I didn't like the idea of the newer games at all. I only wanted to play Pokemon games with that old school, top-down, chibi pixel sprite game design. But then I played some, and I warmed up to the newer games a lot faster than I thought I would. To the point where, hot take, I actually prefer 3D Pokemon now. So Genwunners, I understand, playing Pokemon Red and Blue back in the day was amazing. They were great times in our lives, but they aren't the best games. I've actually been having a quick playthrough of Pokemon Blue at the moment just for fun. And going back to it nowadays, it feels so incredibly bare-boned now I've played the newer games. So it is absolutely the nostalgia value that keeps us coming back. Next argument. There are too many Pokemon now. Okay, I can see where they're trying to come from. As of Generation 9, we've now cracked the 1000 Pokemon milestone. That can seem quite overwhelming, but I don't see that as a problem in itself. In fact, I think the more Pokemon we have, the more enjoyable the games can potentially be. Because if you've got 1000 Pokemon to choose from, unless you're playing competitively, everyone's team is going to be completely different. So you can really express yourself with the team you choose to play with. But that does open another problem for discussion, and that's the problem of the national decks being cut from Sword and Shield onwards, and possibly never returning. We don't entirely know that yet, I really hope it's not true, but that seems like incredibly wishful thinking at this point. And I think that's a problem that's come with Pokemon going 3D. Rather than 2D sprites, which probably don't take too long to make, they now have to create 3D models for every Pokemon, along with animations, which takes a lot longer. Saying that, it's Pokemon, it's the highest grossing media franchise in the world, they've got the money to hire people to do it, so in my view they absolutely should be doing it. And it would add so much to the player experience if they did. But no, I don't think there are too many Pokemon. In fact, I think the franchise would grow incredibly stale if there weren't new Pokemon in each generation. I think the Genwunners are just overwhelmed here because they probably haven't paid attention to Pokemon for so long, and then they're suddenly hit with hundreds of new Pokemon all at once. And that's all I have to cover for now. Honestly, I do think that a lot of Genwunner arguments and opinions boil down to nostalgia bias. They're just flying the flag for their childhood. It's nothing too malicious most of the time. Nostalgia can be quite a blinding thing. I think we've all been guilty of it at some point. Pokemon as a franchise has changed a lot over the years. Some for the good, some for the bad, and even all that comes down to personal preference. As an OG Gen 1 player myself, I'm very much just trying to enjoy Pokemon for what it is nowadays. Even if there are parts of it I'm not so enthusiastic about. Even if I don't agree with some of the directions being taken by Game Freak and the Pokemon Company. And I'd honestly implore Genwunners to just give the newer generations a go. I did, and I'm really enjoying it. I totally get it, Generation 1 is Pokemon in its purest form, right? Back in the day, it was quite simple. There was no Mega Evolution, Gigantamax, Terastallization, weird evolution methods, or any of that. And you can understand how the constant addition of new mechanics and new designs could taint a much loved franchise for a lot of people. But honestly, if you're in that boat, it's worth at least giving them a chance. You might surprise yourself. If there are any more Genwunner arguments to discuss, I might make a part 2, but in the meantime, feel free to drop your own thoughts down in the comments. Maybe you're a self-confessed Genwunner yourself and you want to fight your corner, I don't know. Whoever you are, if you've got something you'd like to say, please do drop it down below, I would love to hear from you. Give the video a like if you want, subscribe for more Pokemon videos, and follow me on Twitch if you'd like to hang out when I go live. Thanks for watching, that's all from me, and I will see you all in the next one.